Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to do a different video for you this week to talk about the reality of MPS for Black students. How are you doing this morning, Heather?
I'm great, thanks. So, this is a conversation that we wanted to have to really ground us in the data, to really talk about the experiences of Black students in our city during Black History Month.
Yeah, and so I think it's important that as we talk about Black history, as we celebrate Black history, Black excellence, that we also see how our students are doing within our education system and start to think about what are the conversations that we need to have in order to better support them. And so, in order to actually have that conversation in a real way, we need to really understand and dive into this data to really get a clear picture of what this reality looks like and what Black students are facing within Minneapolis public schools. So we have 10,910 students enrolled in Minneapolis public schools in this current school year, in the 2020-2021 school year, according to the Minnesota Department of Education. They make up about 33.3% of our student population, which is the second biggest student population, racial student population, behind white students, who make up about 36% of our district. And so when we look at our graduation rates in Minneapolis public schools, we know this is a big deal for so many students. There's always a couple of news articles that come up around how are students doing in Minneapolis public schools? What are the graduation rates? What are the gaps? And so we know over the last several years, there's been an increase, almost a 10% increase for Black students graduating within 4 years. However, I believe that this data is a little misleading when we start to look at some of the data points behind our graduation rates, and understanding that it's really largely up to Minneapolis public schools around what their graduation standards are and how students are meeting those standards.
Right, and an example of that would be looking at the ACT scores. So, one of the things that we know is that 21 is kind of considered the state average of a measure of college readiness. And right now, only 6% of Black students are scoring a 21 or higher on the ACTs. So, while we may be graduating more Black students, we're not necessarily making sure that they have the same ACT readiness as white students.
So then you can start to look younger, right? After you look at, graduation rates for our older students, we start to look at ACT. We can start to look younger and see that this problem starts much, much earlier than high school. And we see that, about 20%, 1 in 5 students who are Black in Minneapolis public schools are going to end up reading at grade level. And we know that third grade reading is such an important benchmark for success moving forward in school. And so we see that this problem starts very, very early on for students, especially Black students in Minneapolis public schools, when we start to look at how they're reading and how successful they'll be moving forward.
Yeah, and we can also see that when it comes to math proficiency. So this is the 2019 school year because we don't have that same data for last year, right? But 17% of Black students were proficient in math. And here's the thing. A lot of people, we one of the places that we get stuck in this conversation is we start to talk about the tests being racist. And yep, that might be true, but also it's important to know that Black students in Minneapolis are way behind Black students statewide. So 27% is the math proficiency rate for Black students for the state of Minnesota.
Right. And so to be very clear, right, the state proficiency level is abysmal in and of itself, right? And Minneapolis is below that, well below that. And so we're talking about a real academic crisis when it comes to our Black students in Minneapolis public schools, and really all of our students of color. But today we're just zooming in on what is the impact that Minneapolis public schools is having on Black students
Yeah.
today. So we know that people have a lot of different feelings around, standardized tests and everything. So we can look at other examples in Minneapolis public schools to see how, they're not serving our Black students. And this wasn't meant to be a video that said, oh, look at how terrible Minneapolis public schools is doing. This is just the reality. And so when we look at all of our data points, we can see an increase or we can see a good amount of students taking advanced courses in Minneapolis public schools, and we can see them passing those courses. A little under 50% of our Black students are taking advanced courses and passing them. But again, you know, there's still so much opportunity for our Black students to excel, to challenge, to push. And we know that it's possible, right? And we can see that it's possible because we can look at all the other student groups, and we can see that Black students are well behind every other student group in Minneapolis public schools when it comes to advanced course taking. Um, and it's just really, but it's just really disappointing, obviously, to see this data the way that it is currently.
And we know one of the things that we know is if Black students have a Black teacher, they are much more likely to do better, to see themselves represented, to get those opportunities advanced learning, because Black teachers know what Black students need. And this is the slide that makes me rage, even though we're supposed to be talking about feelings later. So we have literally less than 10% of teachers that look like our students. We also know that there's nothing that we have seen as we've been watching to provide real, meaningful, with money behind it change that is going to change this in any real way, more than 1% or 2 over the next 10 years.
And so we can then see how this plays out when it comes to how our students are looked at and treated in the classroom, right? And we can see the unbelievable disproportionality, especially when you start looking at African American students who speak English at home. And we can see that, Black students are unbelievably disproportionately pushed out of the classroom. And we see learning opportunities being taken away from them time and time and time again. And this is so problematic. This is right now only comparing quarters 1 through 3 for the last 3 school years, because again, because of the pandemic, the data changed unbelievably so through distance learning. But when we're comparing apples to apples, this has stayed very, very, very consistent for Black students, right? And when we think about what suspensions mean, it means that we're taking away learning opportunities. We're saying that you don't deserve this opportunity because of your behavior, or you can't handle this opportunity because of your behavior. When really it's not just an opportunity, it's their right to an education. And so we don't take that as flippantly for other student groups, especially white students. But again, we don't even need to go into comparison mode here, because we can look at just the current reality and the isolation of Black students and see that this is a crisis in and of itself. And we don't even need to look at how other student groups are doing here. But this is just for context.
Yeah, and I do think, it's interesting. A lot of the conversations can lead us in a lot of ways. Like, oh, it's the test's fault. Oh, it's the state's fault. Oh, it's the this fault. But this is us. This is what our teachers and our principals do to Black students in Minneapolis on purpose. So this one for me is the one that's like really, really hard to explain away, because we could take responsibility for this yesterday if we wanted to. Because we know that suspension and the school to prison pipeline automatically, like, we know once you're suspended, you're all automatically ready to like have an interaction with law enforcement. Many times inside of schools, we know that that's been a conversation this year as well. But we know that these two things directly link together, and we also know that we are not doing anything real and meaningful to change that.
Right. I mean, when you see that, again, Black students who speak English at home are 60% of the suspended population, like, that is heartbreaking when they're only a quarter of the students, right? And so we are targeting these students.
That's right.
And we are targeting them with law enforcement referrals. We are targeting them by pushing them out of our classrooms. And, again, you can go back. Part of the reason is we don't have enough Black teachers to protect them, to advocate for them, to understand them, to make it a welcoming environment. And so when we talk about the current reality for Black students in Minneapolis public schools, this is all before the pandemic, right? Like, none of this is data that's like, oh, the pandemic made this worse. Like, this was a crisis, an unbelievable crisis, before we went into distance learning, before we went into a pandemic. And, we can assume that the pandemic is only going to exacerbate these issues. And so it's really important that we figure out, how do we move forward? And so we are having a conversation with Julia Freeman from Voices for Racial Justice to talk about, what does this data mean for students in real time and in real life? but also what is the way forward? How do we move forward, and where is there hope? And so we hope you join us for that conversation and tune in um, later this week. Look for it. We're excited to have that conversation with Julia.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Bye.